Same period, Nigeria's population was in essentially the earliest stages of the demographic transition, and its population increased from 37 million to about 125 million. However, of course, what a demographer is interested in looking at those diagrams is essentially the age structure of the population. And in this context, if you compare the population of Russia and the population of Nigeria around the year 2000, a very significant feature is obvious that this is a very young age distribution. There are far more people at the base of this pyramid, the Nigerian pyramid, than there are at the base of the Russian pyramid, even though there are more people in Russia than in Nigeria. Moreover, although the decade following the collapse of communism led to particularly low levels of fertility in Russia, as you can see here, even if it had not, there would still have been more people at the base of this pyramid than at the base of that pyramid. So if we now take, these were only produced a month or two ago, if we now take the UN's projections of these two populations out to the middle of this century, a period of only 40 years, Gordana, there, that's what we've got. And you see the effects of momentum. With very low fertility, the UN projects that Russia's population will fall to about 116 million by 2050. Now, I should say that those UN projections assume a rise in Russian fertility. A rise in Russian fertility. I would say, I hope it occurs. Fingers crossed. The population of Nigeria is projected to rise to about 289 million. Now, population projections should always be approached with caution, but the broad relative picture shown there is probably inevitable. Okay, so having talked about some aspects of the transition, I now want to talk about the effects of the transition. Now, in many respects, the demographic transition has been a very good thing, and I can't possibly go through all of the reasons why, but people live much longer, and life is much more assured, very much more assured. And this means, amongst other things, that it's possible for populations to increasingly plan ahead, consider the future. It makes sense for them to save. It makes greater sense for them to save and invest, not only in terms of economic resources, but also in terms of aspects of life like education. With justification, Simon Kuznets argued that the phenomenon of modern economic growth could never have really arisen and been sustained in the absence of mortality decline, which obviously makes it possible for us to think of the future and act with reasonable surety about what's likely to happen. Very, very important. Also, Gordana? Yeah. The movement of populations from low to high levels of urbanization is essentially a result of the demographic transition. As, amongst other things, Jan de Vries and other scholars have shown. And I need hardly tell you that urbanization is essentially a global trend. It's occurring in every country, essentially. In pre-transitional circumstances, death rates varied directly with population density. This is an absolutely crucial point. Or to put that another way, towns tended to be virtual death traps. In that respect, I wouldn't like to have lived here 250 years ago, or in London for that matter. Therefore, there was a ceiling, there was a limit on how urban any society could become. And of course, again, in this context, the Netherlands is particularly important. If we go back to 1750, then the level of urbanization in this country was probably the highest in the world. It was about 30%, more or less. But it couldn't get any higher unless there was fundamental demographic change. The attainment of higher levels of urbanization requires the lifting of the ceiling, and this only occurs as a result of mortality decline, particularly in the urban sector. Consequently, urban natural increase and urbanization become possible, really for the first time in history. Now, this is an extremely difficult argument to illustrate using time series, but yeah, as often is the case, Sweden provides us with the data. So these are Swedish data, and it's a complicated graph, so I'm just going to highlight the main points about it now. But what I want to emphasize is that the world is urbanizing, but it wouldn't be urbanizing if the demographic transition weren't occurring. Now, the bottom line here is the difference between the birth rate and the death rate in Sweden's towns. It's the urban natural increase, and what you should be able to see is that until, I think it's about 1850, my glasses are not that good, it's negative. In other words, in the urban sector, the death rate was much higher than the birth rate. So there wouldn't have been any Swedish towns were it not for a continual movement of people out of rural areas. Oh, sorry, if you could go back. Yep. Oh, yeah. Now, that is the natural increase in Sweden's rural areas, and there was positive natural increase in the rural areas of Sweden, in the villages. Now, one other point I'll show you about this is the crucial importance of the death rate. This is the thick line here. This is the death rate in the urban areas of Sweden. See how incredibly high it was in all of this period, incredibly high. And in fact, it was only at the beginning of the 20th century that the death rate in Sweden's towns became lower than the death rate in rural Sweden, about there. So for all of that period, the death rate in the urban sector was incredibly high. Okay, so these data for Sweden provide a good and extremely rare illustration of this process. You would not have urbanization without the demographic transition. Okay, next one. Now, this is a bit of me. I have argued in a paper which is on this sheet that you have that the movement of societies from autocratic systems of government to democratic systems of government, essentially what we refer to as the process of democratization, is ultimately heavily informed by the demographic transition. Thus, in pre-transitional circumstances, take any pre-transitional society in the world, what you're dealing with is a population that is overwhelmingly rural and is spread around the place. It's diffusely distributed. Moreover, a pre-transitional society has a very high proportion of its population as children. And I believe that in those sorts of circumstances, it's relatively easy for autocratic systems of government to prevail. But as the demographic transition proceeds, it does three things which are very important in the context, I think, of the emergence of modern democratic systems.